So today, this Yellowstone panel, I'm really honored, actually, to be moderator for the panel. I'm clearly the newest person in this Yellowstone group. While Mary and I have been backpacking and hiking and canoeing in Yellowstone for a quarter of a century, we've only lived in Gardner we're coming on to our 4th year in Gardner. So I'm definitely the new kid on the block. And to be able to moderate with people like Carter Niemeyer and Rick McIntyre and Mark Cook and Carol Miller is a thrill, frankly. And what we're going to do, the flow is, hopefully Carter is not taking a shower in addition to changing his shirt. I don't know, Jenny, would that be typical? Yeah. By the way, this is Jenny Niemeyer. So the flow will be that when Carter gets here, I probably don't need to introduce him anymore. How many of you were here on Thursday night for my evening presentation? Ah, good. How many of you weren't here? I won't hold it against you. Okay, good. That helps me. And many of you have heard Carter speak, I would assume. But what he's going to do today, this is my Carter Niemeyer introduction. We have wolves in Yellowstone because of Carter Niemeyer. We have wolves in Idaho because of Carter Niemeyer. We have wolves in Montana and Washington and Oregon and now California because of Carter Niemeyer. When I was talking to him earlier, he said, I am really the Forrest Gump of wolf reintroduction. And I think that is perfect. He has been involved with every single step of the way. Can you imagine that? I mean, he went up to Canada when he arrived. He's going to do a PowerPoint about this, but I'm going to steal a little bit. The first day he arrived in Canada to go get those big, mean Canadian wolves that are going to come down and decimate the cattle, it was minus 52 degrees. Yeah. Yeah, look! Yeah, it's Carter Niemeyer. Come on up. And ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Carter Niemeyer's new shirt. That's a feel. Surprise.
Thank you.
Yes. I was just introducing you, and what I said while you weren't here was I reported what you said to me, that you are the Forrest Gump of wolf reintroduction.
That's accurate.
Life is like a box of wolves. And once Carter's going to do a PowerPoint about that, about going up to Canada, which is really exciting. And then he's going to introduce Rick McIntyre, who is going to spend an hour with you all, or something along that line with you all. And I believe you're going to hear something about Yellowstone wolves, would be my guess. Then we'll take a break, a short break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. We'll take a short break and come back to the rest of the panel, which will be Mark Cook from Wolves of the Rockies and Carol Miller from the 06 Legacy. And then the four of them and myself will answer questions. After each of those two get a chance to speak for a little bit, we'll answer questions about the future of Yellowstone wolves. So without any more introduction, I would like to introduce Carter Niemeyer and his new shirt.
Thank you, Rick. Good job. Thank you for noticing. Now I'm getting embarrassed. All right. right, it gives me great honor and pleasure to be the lead-in for our honored guest today. So you've got to understand that where I was working was kind of on the opposite end of the world of where Rick and other folks were working, so our worlds haven't overlapped all that much, but it all ties together. So today I'm going to try and do this quickly so I don't belabor it. But anyway, this is wolf number 7, one of the monumental wolves that came down from Canada along with others. And I think Rick will expound on this wolf and many others. He knows much more detail than I do. I just got briefly introduced to these animals on the ground in Canada. So further ado, all right, I just want to show you some pictures mostly. I'll talk with them too, but just give you the feeling of catching wolves in Canada in the winter, and it was cold. Our coldest days in the field were around 52 below zero, and we had heat wave days where it was 32 below zero. And imagine flying around in a helicopter with the door off in that kind of weather. We all arrived in Canada, all our trucks parked overnight the next morning. Nobody's truck would even click, let alone start. So all these trucks were drugged to a garage to have head heaters put in them. So here again, you bring all these people together, Americans, Canadians, everybody had I don't know what you want to call it, an ability, a skill, an occupation. So you bring helicopter pilots from Cranbrook, British Columbia. You bring spotter pilots from Alaska. You bring ground troops from the U.S. And we all got acquainted quickly, decided what we were going to do, and went into the field to get it done. The second year in British Columbia, we didn't have any wolves marked. We just went wolf hunting in an area west of the Alaska Highway, west of a place called Pink Mountain. And that was a long ways from Fort St. John. Think cold. Everything, the fixed wings had to be tucked in every night, all kinds of heating units to keep the engines warm so they could start the next morning. And we had 2 pilots who were going to go wolf hunting, finding the wolves, and 2 helicopters to follow up with that team. So all the wolves caught for the wolf reintroduction, both in Hinton, Alberta the first year, Fort St. John the second year, were all caught by helicopter darting. There was no other wolves transported down caught by any other method. And again, once the engine started in the morning, we hot fueled all day. The helicopters never turned off. So we just idled them and would get fuel at remote airstrips. Along the way, we had about 50 barrels sitting on the Alaska Highway. And again, Fort St. John, we had to fly about 60 to 80 miles out to the highway, refuel, and then go wolf hunting another 60 miles further west. Here's another wolf. In my books, I write about Carter's Hope. When I met the capture team, they had never helicopter darted before. And they wanted a net gun. We let them go out and net gun a couple of days, and they net gunned some, and the wolves ate the nets. Chewed right out of them, spit them out, and said, come get me if you want. And so they immediately come back and said, you know, darting might be a better way to do this. So we went out one day and caught this wolf for practice, trying to just get the pilot-gunner compatibility down. But everybody quickly adjusted and learned. So here's a typical riverbed, this up in BC. And this is where the wolves like to travel, because when you got off these riverbeds, the snow was waist deep to shoulder deep. And you could post hole and fall in up to your neck and couldn't even walk. So when we darted these wolves, we had to, I was one of the guys too, it'd get dumped out. We were the muggers. And you had to walk, drag, crawl, roll in this deep snow, but we had to get those wolves down near a riverbed where the helicopter could actually come and pick them up. We had an airplane halfway between so that instead of deadheading and bringing the helicopters back with wolves on board all the way back to Fort St. John, we had this air ambulance, call it. This was the third airplane, and would tuck the passengers in that, and a few times I rode as nurse. And when they're regurgitating meat and passing gas, it's a pretty tight complex inside that plane. But anyway, it all worked out. Every wolf we caught in the field, we GPS'd it, we knew the location, and identified these animals by different geographic areas, and put a toe tag on each one so we didn't lose track of who was where. And the planners up there, Dr. Dave Meach, Dr. Steve Fritz, and others, made these decisions where these wolves would eventually go. So if we caught wolves that were related, 2 or 3 out of a pack, they would be destined to go to Yellowstone. And if we had single unattached wolves caught, those were destined to go to Idaho. Two of my very, very dear friends, Alice Whitelaw, Val Jean Asher. The gals were out there working the pens, transporting wolves in and out when they were sedated, and bringing them in for radio collaring, ear tagging, and other data collection. This is a government trapper friend of mine, Fred Goodman from Washington, Joe Fontaine, and myself. And you see again, we were kind of the kennel details too, making sure the kennels got put up and the kennels tore down. And again, first thing we did, I mean, forgive us, but we all went and bought beaver hats. Walking to breakfast, you had to wrap your face. 2 blocks. It was that cold. So anyway, we set up these temporary kennels with straw and built straw dog houses so the wolves could crawl inside them to stay warm. But again, they're well insulated. And here's one of the wolves inside one of those units. So we caught them, brought them back, processed them, did the data collection, prepared them to go to the U.S., and everybody had their jobs to do along the way. And after the job was done, the wolves were assembled in these kennels, and we had a shipment, you could call it that. Those wolves were put in kennels to ship out, and when we were finished, we tore everything down, burned the straw to get rid of any contaminated stuff, and got everything folded back up. Every night after we froze all day, everybody would have a little downtime and relax. We had Dr. Dave Meach up there again, one of our guides, and guy that helped us make these bigger decisions well above my pay grade. My good buddy Barry, he flew the air ambulance, and he was a tough old bugger and a character, as you can tell. He looked like Popeye and was built like Popeye. All right, so when the wolves were all caught, enough for a cargo load to head for the U.S. This was the type of metal aluminum containers that the wolves were placed in. Fish and Wildlife Service tag on them. And this is the cargo plane that did the transport both from Hinton, Alberta in 1995 and Fort St. John in 1996. And this particular picture was, I believe, at the Missoula airport. These wolves are going to go out into the field in Idaho. This is the Nez Perce tribe who came to bless these animals when they arrived. This wolf number 7, I wrote about her. I'm sure Rick has written about her too, but a very beautiful animal, and you just kind of do wonder what's going through her head after being taken out of her environment up there and being sent to a whole new landscape somewhere else. And of course, here is the arrival. And again, I was up in Canada the whole time, so I missed out on all the ceremonies and the releases. So when I do programs and people say, you're one of the blankety blanks that brought them blankety blank wolves here, I said, no, I was up in Canada. Somebody else brought them. So it's the truth. And Once they were delivered to Yellowstone in that horse trailer, then they were transported kind of old-fashioned way to get them out to the several pens that were constructed. And I'm going to leave a lot of these details to Rick because he can tell you much more trivia about what went on in the park, but this is just sort of the grand scheme to set the stage. Once they got them near the pens, then you had to wrestle them on in to the pens to release them. This is Mike Phillips, Molly Beatty, Bruce Babbitt. So some of the big shots were there for the release. So in Yellowstone, it was called a soft release, and what that means is they were brought in these shipping containers and released into about 1 acre pens, and there they would be acclimated to Yellowstone and held for, Rick can tell you these details too. I don't know exactly how many months they were kept, but again, it was to acclimate them and hopefully break some of the homing instinct of wanting to leave the pens and go back to Canada. Number 9 is another wolf that I'm hoping Rick can talk about, but this wolf and I crossed trails many times, and I wrote about her in one of my books. But I won't take the time today. I want to get to the guest. But nonetheless, this wolf, her and I crossed trails a couple times in Canada. Then she got out of the park, got near some livestock. I had to go out and rescue her and bring her back and put her in what they call the Rose Creek pen. Right there, this is a monumental pen. It still stands today as a monument to the wolf reintroduction, and it's near the Buffalo Ranch in the Lamar Valley, and you can walk up to that any time of year, actually. But if you get a chance, look at it. When number 9 and her pups were in this pen, shortly after we rescued them for Red Lodge, and the trees blew down in a big windstorm, caved in the fences. Pups got out, and then they called me back again, so we were trapping puppies and putting them back in the pen. Found out they were climbing out as quick as we put them in, so we quit doing that. And it all worked out. All of the number 9's pups survived in this situation, and I came back in August for their collaring, and again, Rick can take it from there. And there's me standing there thinking about all that went on many years later. So we can't forget Idaho too. In Idaho we did a hard release, which means they came down in these shipping containers, but were transferred into makeshift pens, put on trailers or sleds behind snowmobiles, and were immediately taken out into the forests and released. It was a Frank Church Wilderness of No Return. Some were turned loose near Dagger Falls on the south side of the wilderness, and others were turned loose near Corn Creek on the north side of the wilderness. But the hard release is we just let them go and hope they stayed in the vicinity. Both methods worked equally well. 66 wolves were brought down, and both techniques showed that the wolves were successful. I'm not going to belabor these figures, but again, one of the mythologies is that we brought down this bigger, meaner, bloodthirsty, mega Canuck wolf, different than the little coyote-sized ones that once lived in Idaho, which is all baloney. But anyway, here's some of the body weights just to show you again. The average wolf weighs 100 pounds. Females smaller, males a little bit bigger. That's one shipment. And here's another shipment. Again, notice 113 pounds, 112. But the cap, again, no big, massive wolves. I believe this was the biggest wolf brought from Canada on the releases over 2-year time, 130 pounds. And that is a big male wolf. It's more weights, smaller size. I think the Hinton wolves run a little smaller out of Alberta. The ones in Fort St. John were a little bigger, more robust wolf. And more weights. I'm sure Rick will talk a little bit about the Crystal Pack and the Molly. Crystal Pack and the Molly Pack are one and the same. The name was changed. After the wolves were put in the park, some recollaring was required. And again, Dr. Smith called me to come down and do the helicopter darting for him because he wasn't certified to do that at the time. So one day I was blessed to have the mugger, Dr. Dave Meach, riding with us. And this is the Crystal Pack, I believe the original breeders. And for a long time, this was the biggest wolf captured in Yellowstone, weighed 141 pounds. But he did have a lot of bison meat in him that day, so he was probably more like 130 pounds. So just give you a quick setting of what happened. You can see starting in the mid-'80s when wolf monitoring was kind of put on here, you can see there was a few wolves in the lower 48 in the northern Rockies region. These animals were coming in from Canada, same regions where we caught wolves, especially in Hinton, Alberta, but they weren't breeding. There was nothing sustainable, and humans were knocking them off about as steady as they come along. Here's 95, 96 shows the reintroduction, and you can just see how prolific and resilient that population of 66 wolves were, and immediately they took this as central Idaho population, greater Yellowstone population, and then this blue here shows you the recolonization that was slowly happening where wolves come from Canada into Montana mostly. So today, we don't know exactly how many wolves, but the guesstimate at 2017 was a little over 2,300 packs, and at least 192 of them were breeding pairs, which means that they had at least 2 pups that were born in April and survived till December 31st following their first birthday. That was the definition. So, someone mentioned the other day about social carrying capacity. That's really how the wolves have been treated since we recovered them. And social carrying capacity, again, is just talking about social tolerance. How many will people tolerate, put up with? And that is pretty much driven by politics. There's a lot of places wolves can still occupy that they haven't gotten to, but in the places where we reintroduced wolves, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, put it mildly, they're killing the hell out of them now. And the plan always was that the feds would recover them and hand management off to the state, and that's what happened. And now it's up to us, I guess, to try and convince the state that they're not the devil incarnate and that we should maintain them. I'm going to let Rick probably talk about this too, but Yellowstone population of wolves immediately soared to about 172 wolves when they first were put in there because it was kind of like a Serengeti with all of the elk and bison and things to eat. So the population grew, but at the same time the elk population was in decline for a whole number of reasons, and wolves contributed to that. But I just want to fast forward to 2018. The elk population has begun to show an increase, and the wolf population in the park stabilized after some time and adjusted to their prey base to about 100 wolves. And again, that's a dynamic that could go up or go down. So 20 years later, here's just again, you can't believe how many people each had a part in this. So there was just not a couple of us that did this. It was a whole team effort, everyone offering their skills, everybody bringing this talent together, and everyone doing their part, and it was a monumental success, in my opinion. So, fast forward, 2015, during the 20th anniversary, some of us got together, and so I got to help catch them, and Dr. Doug Smith is the person in charge of maintaining and monitoring the wolf population in Yellowstone Park. Today, he's one of the last of the federal Mohicans who's still on the payroll. Everyone else, the team pretty much is retired and went away, which leads me to the person I'm very honored to introduce today, Rick McIntyre here, because being wolf biologists and doing our part, Probably the most important guy in this whole thing is the interpreter, the person in Yellowstone who goes face to face, and I'm going to exaggerate, but maybe not, talk to millions of people over the years. He's been there for decades, and he's a household name. A lot of people know his name, but Rick McIntyre, also recognized by the guy that drives the yellow truck or the blue car. And everyone who goes to Yellowstone and everyone who calls me says, how do I find this guy? So I described the vehicle he drives, but I said mostly just look for a huge cluster of humanity gathered in a tight spot along the road somewhere. And I said, Rick McIntyre will be on his chair in the middle of this, recording on paper and into a tape recorder everything he sees. And this guy is amazingly meticulous, has an absolute uncanny ability to remember radio collars, ear tag numbers, spots, saddles, and any other feature on a wolf. So again, Rick and I aren't really close chums, but I have the highest admiration for Rick McIntyre, and I want him to get up here, and he's the one you really want to listen to today.
Hey, thanks a lot. Nice job. Okay. You need to turn this on. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I don't do too many of these things, but I felt that this was something I needed to do, so I'm very happy to be here. And that was very gracious of you, Carter. Thank you very much. I don't know if you ever heard this, Carter, but in the early years of the reintroduction, where in any given pack we had a mixture of the ones that you had captured in Canada and the ones that had been born in Yellowstone in America, we gradually figured out a way to tell the Canadian-born wolves from the American-born wolves. And as we explained it to park visitors, the secret was listening to them very carefully when they did a group howl. We never quite understood why this was the case. Maybe someone here might have a suggestion. But after a group howl, for whatever reason, the ones that Carter had brought down from Canada, they would always do a French translation of what they said. Now, why would they do that? Okay, yeah. American wolves didn't get it either. Also, their money looked funny. Well, I'm just one of many people, but I got to be the person that got to see the wolves the most. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background before I got to Yellowstone. Just a second here. I worked in Denali National Park for 15 summers. So that's where I first spent some time with wolves, descendants of the wolves that Adolph Murray had studied there in the 40s that he wrote about in his book, The Wolves of Mount McKinley, the East Fork Pack. So I was there for 15 summers. After that, I worked a little bit in Glacier National Park, got to know Diane Boyd there, and got to see those wolves. I wrote a couple of books about wolves, the Society of Wolves, and War Against the Wolf. That brought me to the early 90s, during the time that wolf reintroduction was a possibility for Yellowstone. So for my writing projects, I drove from Glacier to Yellowstone and interviewed a lot of the Park Service people that were involved in planning it. John Varley, who was the head of all the research in Yellowstone, Norm Bishop, interviewed Ed Bangs, who was the recovery leader for wolf recovery for the Rocky Mountains. Got to know a lot of the players. And then I worked out an arrangement where I transferred down to Yellowstone the year before the reintroduction in 1994. Now, my career with the Park Service through that time was primarily as a Park Service naturalist. Those are the people that do the slideshows, the ranger walks, the children's programs, etc. So I had been doing that for many, many years, and when they hired me for the summer of '94, as far as I know, I was the only one on the ranger staff in Yellowstone that had been around wild wolves elsewhere. So they gave me the title of wolf interpreter, and all of my programs in '94 were on wolves. So that would be slideshows, campfire talks. They gave me a wolf pelt. And in the Park Service, we have something we call roving interpretation. We discovered that only a certain percentage of people go to our evening slideshows. The majority of people don't. So it's kind of like being a street preacher. You go to where the people are rather than asking them to come to your cathedral. So I would have my full ranger uniform on. I'd carry the wolf pelt to a place like Old Faithful, one of the waterfalls. And if you have a wolf pelt, they come to you. So I would explain the possibility of the reintroduction, and I would get the word out to far more people than what you would reach if you waited for them to come to you. Now, in those days, I worked in the desert at Big Bend National Park in West Texas for the winter. So I wasn't actually there for the release, but I had a lot of friends that kept me filled in. And based on what Carter has already told you, he talked a little bit about Wolf 7, who I knew very well, Carter, knew her for her whole life. She was a female pup brought down as part of the Rose Creek pack, along with her mother, number 9, who Carter also spoke of. They were unable to find 9's original mate. He probably had been killed by hunters or trappers. So they had an extra lone male, a huge guy, number 10. They put him in the pen with the mother and daughter, and that worked very well romantically. He and 9 got together, and by the time they were released, she was pregnant. One of the other packs was known as the Crystal Creek Pack, who Carter also spoke about. And the book that I just finished working on, it will be out this October, which will be called The Rise of Wolf 8. Wolf 8 was one of the 4 pups brought down in the Crystal Creek Pack. And he actually was the smallest of all the male wolves brought down. He was, in essence, the runt of his litter. So he had 4 brothers who were the same age that he was, but they were much bigger than he was. He also was different in another way. His brothers had beautiful, sleek black coats. He had this very dull gray coat that made him look like the worst thing possible if you're a wolf. It made him look like a coyote. So probably his brothers made fun of him. And his mother was wolf number 5. She was whitish, very beautiful. His father was a huge guy, wolf number 4, and he was black. So he was the odd man out. And I got to know 8 and his family when I returned to Yellowstone from Big Bend in the spring of '95. Just a few weeks after they had been released, and my first full day I saw the entire family. And that was the period where we hadn't quite caught on yet that this was going to be a big deal as far as the public was concerned. None of us expected that the Canadian wolves would be very visible. My goal for that first summer, expecting that I do a lot of backcountry travel, was to see one wolf. I was hoping that if I could see one wolf, even for a moment, I would be a happy guy. My first full day in the park that spring, I saw all 6 Crystal Creek wolves, and they were visible for most of the day. So what we discovered that was unexpected was that the wolves seemed to understand that this was the promised land, that they were safe, that no longer were they targeted by hunters and trappers. And so on a normal day, we could see them for hours. And that unexpected development, thank you. I'm not used to this. Thank you. We just got hordes of people that were having the time of their life. And I was using the same scope that I used in Denali, an old Bushnell Space Master. And so to me, the thing seemed to do would be to get out there early, find the walls, set up my scope, and as people would come along, invite them to see it. And the response that we would get from that, people were crying, they were getting very emotional. I, being the nearest government bureaucrat in uniform, would have citizens charge at me with the intent of hugging me and thanking me. I'm sure that happens to you, Carter, all the time. Yeah. And I just happened to be the guy that was in the middle of that. And I had worked for the Park Service for a long time prior to that, a long time since, and there's never been anything like it. It was almost Beatles-level excitement. It was a big deal, except there were 6 of the Beatles, the Crystal Creek Wolves. Well, getting back to number 8, I met a woman, a ranger, that had been one of the security guards when the Crystal Creek Wolves were in their pen. There had been a lot of death threats against the wolves. It would have been easy for someone to sneak in there with a rifle or poisoned meat and kill all of them right off the bat. That was a definite possibility. So some of the unsung heroes of the Yellowstone reintroduction were those men and women rangers who in January and February and early March, in the minus 52-degree weather, had night shifts. And they were out there by themselves with the potential of bad guys out there too. She had some stories to tell about the Crystal Creek Wolves that at times were a little bit hard to hear because it was about 8 being bullied and picked on. So for almost the entire time in the pen, because the other wolves, his brothers, had little else to do, they spent their time giving the little guy a hard time. So they would team up, they would charge at him, the 3 of them would beat him up, he would try to fight back, but he was just too small to do stuff. They would leave him alone for a while, he'd take a nap, and it would just be over and over again. He was the lowest ranking wolf in his family by far, and Linda Veres, she told me how he would always be the last to eat. Some of you may know some kids that have had an upbringing like that, and it's really a sad thing when you're a witness to something like that. So you could see that she was very emotional about the very difficult time that Abe had. But his life got better after they were released, in the sense that his brothers had more to do, more distraction, so life was better. And after I'd heard those stories, I really began to concentrate on how he was developing, how he was growing, how he was coping with being a free wolf now. And there was one day where he was separate from everyone else, and I think he had some idea in his mind that he was going to become this great hunter and feed the whole pack by himself and become a famous wolf and get his picture on National Geographic. And so he zeroed in on potential prey, and the prey had no idea that a wolf was stalking him. And very quietly, very slowly, very deliberately, it got to within this far of the rear end of a 2,000-pound bison. And then he stopped, and he kind of, now I think he would like some help from his family, because it was just, he was probably about 75 pounds at that time, just him and the bison. He just didn't know what to do at that point. And the bison kind of went like this and was not impressed. And At that point, a mosquito, a fly, or something must have bothered the bull, and he flicked his tail, and 8 ran away. That was just too much for him. So he wasn't quite at the level that he wanted to be. But sometimes, whether it's a yearling wolf or a kid, you get to see something else that causes you to think there's more to the story. So this is the story of 8 the hero. Just a few weeks after that, he was with 2 of his big brothers. They were both black. He was the odd man out, the gray. And they were playing, and one of his big brothers, for some reason, just took off running into a stand of conifers. We couldn't really see what was going on there, but the 3 wolves, all brothers, we could get glimpses that there were animals running back and forth, but we didn't know what was happening. And then a couple of minutes later, one of his big brothers ran out at his absolute top speed, running for his life, with a freshly killed elk calf in his jaws. The other black brother ran out behind him, and then, as always, the slowest and the smallest was 8, pulling up the end. So I was pretty impressed that the brothers had teamed up to kill an elk calf, even though they were pretty inexperienced. But it turned out that was not the story at all, because there was another animal there, and it was his elk, and he had killed it, and it was a 500-pound grizzly bear. So the 3 brothers were running like this, and the grizzly was gaining on them with the total intent of striking these guys down, getting back his calf, with 8 being the slowest and the one that would get it first. So the brother with the calf was out in front, and the other guy, and then 8. And when the bear was probably within a length and a half of grabbing 8 and smashing him to the ground and tearing him apart, here's what happened. 8 stopped, and he turned around, and with a lot of confidence for his age, he stood up to the grizzly bear, while his brothers were totally unaware, just running off. And he was not going to budge. He was standing in front of that grizzly bear, and that's what he was going to do. And it worked. The grizzly was confused. He didn't understand why this little thing was doing this. And their eyesights are very poor. I think at a certain point, the bear could no longer see where the black wolf was with his calf. He was confused. He didn't know what to do. And he just turned around and walked away. So 8 was the big hero that day, except that no one other than me had seen that. None of his brothers had turned around. They just thought that they had outrun the bear. And when 8 finally caught up with them, they didn't share the calf with them. They hogged it to themselves. So that's what really caused me to have a special feeling, a special emotional attachment to 8 for the little guy that had become an unlikely hero. Well, as all that was happening, Carter spoke about wolf number 9. I think most of you know the story, that she and her mate, number 10, they denned outside the park. He was illegally shot. The guy was caught and convicted, spent time in prison. But it was a single mother wolf with 8 newborn pups. And that represented 43% of the population of Yellowstone at that time. Normally, the Park Service does not intervene with wildlife, but this was a critical moment. And it was a terrible illegal act. Those pups would probably not have survived. So with the help of Carter and many other people, they were able to find her den. They captured her. They found her den site. And Doug Smith, the wolf biologist, he is very tall. And so they asked him to use his long arms to reach into the den and one by one pull out the pups. There had been a total of 8 that were thought to be in the den. He pulled out 7, and that seemed to be it. They had drugged number 9. They had all the other pups ready to go in the helicopter to bring them back. So there was a lot of stress, a lot of attention. They needed to hurry up. But Doug kept on thinking that there was one more pup, but he just could not find it. Doug told me that he got a stick and he started poking in, And at a certain point, he poked something and there was some give to it, like it was soft. So he borrowed a pair of pliers, Leatherman pliers, and he kind of clicked them like this. And at a certain point, there seemed to be something there. He didn't know what it was, but whatever it was wanted to pull away from him. So Doug was pulling this way, and whatever it was pulling the other direction. He yanked it out, and it was the 8th pup, a black pup. Now, both Doug and the park veterinarian that we had at that time, Mark Johnson, both of them are very experienced in being able to identify wolves as they age. And both of them have told me that they felt that that 8th pup, the one that was almost left behind, was the one that eventually became the most famous Yellowstone wolf, number 21, who was destined to be the undefeated, undisputed heavyweight champion of Yellowstone National Park. My first book is called The Rise of Wolf 8, and the second book on 21 probably will be called The Reign of 21. And so he just barely survived. So they brought them back to the pen at Rose Creek, and the plan was to release them after 6 months, as Carter said. So that was in the middle of '95. Now, Carter also mentioned wolf number 7. She was the daughter of number 9. She left home and paired off with one of 8's brothers, number 2, and they established the first new pack in Yellowstone, naturally forming pack since the 1920s. In honor of Aldo Leopold, who was the first biologist to suggest bringing wolves back to Yellowstone, they named that pack the Leopold Pack. And my third book, which will be about Wolf 302, is about one of number 7's daughters, one of number 7's sons, excuse me. But we'll get back to the timeline. So in the fall of 1995, the time came to get ready to release the Rose Creek wolves. At that time, those pups were 6 months old. They would be as hungry as teenagers, and they still just had a single mother. So they made it to that point in life, but for her to succeed in having a good percentage of them surviving from that point on, still as a single mother would be pretty much impossible. But there was nothing else the Park Service could do. And then something happened that pretty much could be described as a miracle because no one expected it, and it just changed the history of wolves in Yellowstone. One of the most important events ever. We talked about number 8, how he'd been picked on and bullied. And sometimes, as with many young kids that go through that type of experience, they become loners. They find that life is just easier if they're by themselves most of the time. And so that's what 8 was doing at that time in his life. He was a little bit over a year old now. And he had a lot of time to explore, to do whatever he wanted to. He was independent. We think what happened in the fall of 1995 is that he may have heard some wolves howling off in the distance up this one drainage on the north side of Lamar Valley. He went up there, came around a bend in Rose Creek, and saw something he had never seen in his life before. Something that, as far as he knew, didn't even exist. Because every day of his life, every moment of his life, he was always the smallest wolf. And what he was seeing for the first time were 2 of 9's pups that were already out of the den that were smaller than he was. This was inconceivable that there was a wolf smaller than him. And instantly, what kicked in was empathy for them. He ran over, started sharing some food, started romping around with them, started making friends, and in those few moments, that was the beginning of him adopting and raising them. Number 9 must have been watching this. She was still in the pen with the other pups. She desperately needed help. At first glance, this guy didn't look like the right candidate. He was too small, and he still looked like a coyote. But he was there, and he was available. So when she came out, things happened, and that's how little number 8 became an alpha male of the Rose Creek Pack, the adopted father of 8 pups, including number 21. We've since had many, many other cases similar to that. New male comes in, and every time that happens, the same thing, adopts the pups and raises them. Now, we'll jump ahead to January of '96. I was in the park at that time taking a class at the Institute. We heard a big commotion outside. It was the arrival of some of the second batch of Canadian wolves, the ones from British Columbia. And in that batch, well, in that group, they were known as the Druid Peak wolves. And the guys that were transporting the Druid wolves, when we came out of our class, you could see that something had happened that these guys weren't quite sure how to deal with. They had a story to tell. On the way down, when they checked inside the horse trailer, you saw Carter's pictures of the metal cages that each wolf was in, something like this. They went inside just to make sure that everything was fine. Each wolf was in its own cage. And one of the wolves, a big male, number 38, when they looked in, he was just freely walking around the inside of the horse trailer. They looked at his metal cage, and it had been just ripped apart. He had used his jaws just to tear it apart, kind of like King Kong with his chains. And everyone was kind of stepping back at this guy. What is the deal with this wolf? And this was like Super Wolf. But they managed to tranquilize him. They put him in a stronger cage. So he was a lone wolf that was captured, put him in a pen with the wolves that were called Druid Peak, with number 39, the mother wolf, and her 3 female pups, 3 daughters, 40, 41, and 42. And like with 9 and 10, that worked. So when they got out of the pen in late winter of '96, no one expected what they were going to do next. They decided that they wanted Lamar Valley as their territory, despite the fact that the Crystal Creek wolves, 8's original family, had claimed it. They were denning, for those of you that know Lamar Valley, near the Footbridge lot. And just slightly before I got back to the park that spring, there was an incident. The Druid wolves tracked down the location of the Crystal Creek den, attacked the other family, killed their alpha male, number 4, injured the mother wolf, and her pups were never seen again. We don't know if the Druids found the den and crunched each one, or because of the injuries to the mother wolf that she wasn't able to support him. But whatever litter she had, no survivors. So it was a devastating blow to the family. And they had to abandon their territory to the Druid wolves. They lost. They went south and thrived in Pelican Valley, were eventually renamed the Molly's wolves, and they have a whole story to tell. But the wolf that they killed, number 4, was 8's father. And 8 now was the alpha male of the next pack over to the west, the Rose Creek pack. So his family had been vanquished, and his father was killed, almost for sure, by that monster wolf, 38. And boy, if 8 had any awareness of it, and I think he did, for him to think that his father, who in his world was the biggest and strongest wolf that he had ever seen, to think that his father could have been killed by an even bigger and more aggressive male, that must have been a pretty scary thought. And that leads us to June of 1996. I was at Slough Creek. I had about maybe 30 people with me. We were on a hill. We were watching 8 and those pups that they had adopted, including number 21. They were yearlings by that point. Number 8 had bred and gotten pregnant number 9, and they had 3 pups together. So 8 was now not only an adopted father of 8 yearlings, but a biological father of 3 pups. So he was a busy guy, a lot of responsibility. two primary jobs in life. You could describe it this way. If you're the alpha male and your family is hungry, you're supposed to do something about it. Go out and kill an elk, kill a bison. And he became a good hunter. The other responsibility is more dangerous. If your family is threatened, you're supposed to do something about that. So, that day, we saw 8 stop among the yearlings. He looked across the creek to the west. I expected he just saw some elk, that maybe he was thinking of going out on a hunt. I looked up there. It wasn't elk. It was the Druid wolves. And led by 38, the very wolf that had killed his father, 38 and all the other Druid wolves were charging straight downhill directly at 8 and his family. Now, I was with these 30 people, and I was the ranger on duty, and I realized that I was going to have to prepare these people for what we were about to see. I explained to everyone, if two males fight, if there's a real significant difference in the size and the fighting experience of each opponent, the battle will be over in a few moments. With the defeated wolf on his back in the defenseless position, the winning wolf on top, and the way that one wolf kills another is to tear out the throat. We knew in Yellowstone that, as in other places where there's no legal hunting or trapping, the most common cause of death for a wild wolf is to be killed in battle defending your family. So we were about to see number 8 be killed by the very wolf that had killed his father, and I felt I had to prepare the people. 8 started running, but to even get to number 38, he had to run a steep uphill route. So he was way smaller than his opponent, had virtually zero fighting ability, probably never won a fight in his life, and he'd be out of breath even by the time the fight began. So they were both gray wolves. That meant that when they crashed into each other and started rolling around on the ground, we couldn't tell them apart. But just as I had prepared the people, within a few moments, yes, the fight was over. With one wolf on his back, the other wolf standing over him, biting at will. But there's a phrase that was made famous a few Olympics ago that some of you may remember. It actually was in the form of a question. Do you believe in miracles? So guess who won? The little guy. So it'd be like me defeating Carter. Not going to happen. So all the yearlings, included 21, run up to see their hero, Dad, beating up this monster guy. It was unbelievable. It was better than WrestleMania. And then something maybe even more impressive happened. After a number of bites, with 38 at the mercy of 8, 8 stepped back and let the guy go, spared his life. He chased him out of the territory. 38 ran off with a tucked tail. 21, all the other yearlings helped their dad chase the wolf. But that made a huge impression on 21. And during the course of his long life of 9 years, his career as the undefeated, undisputed heavyweight champion of Yellowstone National Park, never lost a fight. On several occasions, he was able by himself to defeat 6 opponents at once. Never killed a defeated opponent because of what he'd seen his adopted father do. Now, we need to move on so we can finish up everything that we need to speak about. 21 was a loyal son to 8. He eventually grew much bigger and stronger than his father, but they had this relationship that was based on respect. And 8 treated 21 as an equal rather than a subordinate male. And 21, there was never any hint that he had any idea of ever challenging his father for the top position. They were perfectly matched in character and personality. And essentially, 21 was an apprentice to 8. Probably my favorite story about 21 was one year in 97, the year after that battle. He was helping his parents raise a litter of 7 new pups. And 21 was the workhorse in the family. He killed more elk than any other wolf in the pack. He was so big and strong that he could swallow 20 pounds of meat and maybe carry another 20 pounds in his mouth, bringing it back to his mother and to the pups. But that year in that litter, there was one pup that had something wrong with him, and we never quite figured out what it was. So 21 would show up, 6 pups would run down, they'd greet their big brother, he'd play with them, share food, they would climb all over him, everyone was happy. But then we would see the last guy up there, and whether there was something wrong with his eyesight or his mental development or his physical development, he couldn't see well, he couldn't move well, and he was usually by himself. Now, this is sometimes hard for me to get through, this emotional part, that 21 would watch for that guy. And after doing all that work to exhaustion, bringing back all that food, he would look for that pup, leave everyone else, and go to that guy and hang out with them. He did that over and over again. I do a lot of talks for kids, and to try to get that point across, I oftentimes will ask, how many of you have ever had a difficult day, people were picking on you, you just really feel bad, you get home, you don't have a friend in the world, and your dog sees you. And your dog wants to be your friend. And your dog seems to understand what you're going through. So if you've ever wondered where a dog's sense of empathy for their human friends comes from, it came from a wolf ancestor just like 21. Now, by that time, 21 was over 2 years old. He had stayed with his family longer than probably what might be average. And then when he was 2.5 years old, it was time for him to set out and find a female companion. So he did something which seemed to be a very, very dangerous thing. He trotted right into the middle of the Druid territory, the sworn enemies of his family. But 21 always had real good timing. We don't know if he understood this or not, but he arrived in Lamar Valley shortly after another bad guy had shot and killed number 38 and another adult male in the Druid pack. So in November of 97, when 21 walked into the middle of enemy territory, it was just several adult females and their 5 pups. And whatever human sex symbol you want to talk about, Brad Pitt. By the way, just a few days ago, I had lunch with Matthew McConaughey. He was one of those guys, wasn't he? Yeah. Weren't you married to him for a while, Matthew McConaughey? Wasn't that you? No? Okay. And I had to kind of fight off all the women, not from me, but from him, yeah. So, yeah, 21 showed up, and those females took one look at him, and the deal was sealed. Now, the alpha female, number 40, she was a problem. She had a very aggressive personality, maybe even psychopathic. She had driven out her own mother, was just about to drive out one of her sisters. Those of you that watch Game of Thrones, she could play Queen Cersei without acting. And she was especially taken with 21, and she was a blonde, so he was kind of interested, but you could see that there was another sister that, yeah, okay, this is the thing over here, and that was 42. She was kind of drab. To a human eye, there didn't seem to be anything too special about her, but she was the one for 21. And we eventually saw that they were perfectly matched in personalities and character. So for the next few years, 21, well, actually for the rest of his life, he was the alpha male. Like number 8, he adopted the pups that were born to the previous guy, raised them. He had a very difficult time dealing with 40. As in all wolf packs, being the alpha female, she was the absolute boss of the family. If you're the alpha male, that's fine, but you have to do what you're told by the alpha female. So if 21 wanted to go on a hunt in this direction, and he turned around and saw that 40 wanted to go a hunt in that direction, he went on a hunt in that direction. So it didn't matter that he was almost twice her size. She was the queen, maybe he was the king, but the truth was he just worked for her. But he had this special relationship with 42, and he was always looking out for her. When she was beaten up by 40, he would go to her, and it would be almost like he was comforting her. If she had been driven away from the pack by her sister, he would go over and lay down next to her. One time when 40 was just way over the line of being aggressive to 42, 42 ran over to 21 and just kind of like hid behind him. Even 21 was afraid of 40. But he would just stand there in a confident manner, and that was enough to turn 40 aside. So he did everything he could to help, but there's much more to tell about the story of 21 and 40 and 42. That's in the second book. And this book is about 8. So by that time, 8 was getting to be an old wolf. In Yellowstone, average lifespan was about 4 or 5, and he was, 7, 8 years old at that point. In the winter of 99-2000, I was at Sioux Creek. It was a day very cold. It was hard for me to keep warm. He and his family had found an elk calf that was probably about 250 pounds, probably twice his size, that was in the freezing water in the creek. I think the calf had fallen in. Aiden and his family spent 3 hours watching the calf, which meant that during those hours the calf was weakening due to hypothermia. And I think Aiden saw this as an opportunity as a training session in hunting for the pups. So he brought his pups over to the edge of the ice to make sure that they understood this was an opportunity, this animal is vulnerable. But none of them wanted to go in the cold water. I wouldn't have gone in the water myself. So even though 8 was old and he was hurting and he had a lot of injuries, he just had to fulfill his duties. So he stepped in. He had an epic fight with the elk that he was mostly losing. He got kicked in the head. He got stomped underwater. He almost drowned. Probably had a concussion when he got kicked in the head. He was not doing well. He looked like a drowned rat. Finally, one of the pups was willing to help out. He jumped in the pool of water. The dad and the son worked together. That worked better. They both grabbed either end of the elk. They dragged it out on the ice. And then I think 8, even though he was so exhausted, he looked at the other pups who now were running over. And he decided, okay, lesson is over. You guys do the rest. And then he went over and warmed up as best he could, and his sons and daughters finished the job. Now, after 8's death, and I'll explain that in a moment, they examined his skull. And I've consulted with some of the experts that examined that skull, like Sue Ware and Jim Halfpenny, and they showed me pictures of it. And I don't know if there's a better word than pitiful as to what physical condition he was at that time. One of his canines had been broken off at the base. 2 others had been severely chipped. Only one of his 4 canines, which are his most effective weapons, was somewhat intact. all the molars here were extremely damaged, and all the bone material in the upper jaw here and here looked like a honeycomb due to years of infections. So for those of you that have ever had a toothache, multiply that by 10, that was never going to end. No dentist was ever going to treat that wolf. So I'd rather not say it this way, but to explain what Ate was going through, he would have been in agonizing pain. And Jim Halfpenny measured the distance from this broken canine to this missing molar, and Jim told me that it was the exact width of an elk hoof. So we think, and this could have happened to a person with a horse or a mule, you're too slow, you get kicked right here in his case, knocked out or damaged all those teeth, and really did a job on him. So he was very old, he had suffered a lot of injuries, probably like an NFL player, had a whole series of concussions. He was at the very, very end of his life. And then they had a misunderstanding with the Druid wolves. And due to the misunderstanding, the two packs, who were pretty much evenly matched, charged at each other, each one thinking the other one was the aggressor. On the Druid side, their alpha male was out in front, number 21. On the Rose Creek side, out in front was their alpha male, number 1, father and son. This part of the story is very hard for me to talk about because it's very emotional, since I knew the two wolves so well. And it's a very long and involved story to tell it properly. I do it in the book. Because it's so difficult for me, I'm just going to give you some hints of what happened, because we need to finish up. What I'm going to tell you is that it was on 21. I'm sure that 21, out of respect and gratitude for his father, was desperately trying to figure out a way out of this situation. But his problem was 40. Perhaps 21 could have been thinking that a way to get out of this without number 8 being harmed would be for 21 to use his superior strength to take 8 down and then do the same thing that 8 had done to 38, take him down and then let him go to live another day. The problem with that was that something like that had happened a few months earlier with one of 21's sisters in the Rose Creek Pack. He had helped them chase the sister, helped them take her down, and then he just started to walk away thinking that was the end of it. Doug Smith was doing a flight that day, and he documented that as 21 was walking away, 40 came in, pounced on the female, and with extreme prejudice, tore her apart. In every one of Doug's pictures, it's only 40 attacking the female, and every picture, 21 is over here looking the other way. So if he had followed what I thought could work, as gently as he could, taking 8 down and then letting him go, what would 40 do? She would run in, and there was no stopping 40. So I'm just going to have to say that 21 thought of something that I wouldn't have been able to think of. Probably no one here would have been able to think of. Something that showed the extent of his gratitude and respect of 8, that, let's just say, resolved that situation in a way that 8 survived. A few months after that event, 8 got in a fight with one other elk. We didn't know that it was happening at the time. Doug Smith did a flight shortly after that, got 8 signal, flew up Slough Creek, pinpointed the general location, could not see 8. But the signal was twice as fast as normal. That's what we call a mortality signal. Radio collars have a motion detector in them. And if there's no motion after a certain number of hours, the beats per minute double. That's what was going on with 8's collar. They couldn't see him. So Doug and some other Wolf Project people rode up to that meadow, They got the signal from what appeared to be a section of the creek, a fairly tranquil, relatively shallow pool, and they saw 8 underwater, under a log. They fished him out. He had a few new injuries, a few new bruises, but nothing that seemed to be life-threatening, nothing that was too obvious, a few new dings in his head. It appeared that he had drowned. However, Doug emphasized that the creek was not in flood. It was a slow-moving pool, no fast current. Even for a non-swimmer like me, I would have been able to get through it, and dogs are good swimmers. So in talking quite a bit to Doug Smith, his theory, and I think he's right, is this, that 8 had one last fight with an elk up creek from there. Now that he was much slower, more injured, more dinged up, probably had some new concussions, Doug's theory was that once again, 8 got kicked in the head. And whether that just knocked him out and he fell in the pool, or perhaps he was just stunned like a football player would be on a hard tackle, when he fell down into the water, he didn't have the ability to get out. So for a wolf that had gone through all those things in his life, for him to have a death that probably was as peaceful as that, as drowning, that was probably a pretty good way for him to go. So he died a hero. He died doing the best he could to feed his family. And unfortunately, as I continued to work on in Yellowstone over the years, people forgot about 8. Everyone wanted to talk about 21, and there was good reason for that. And I tried to tell stories of 8, but everyone wanted to hear about 21. And there was certainly a gradual assessment by many people that maybe 21 was destined to be considered the greatest wolf who ever lived. A lot of people, I think, might say that. He certainly would be a good choice, but here's my thought on that. If 21 had any conception that something like that was said about him, that he was the greatest wolf, he would absolutely deny it because he knew the truth. He knew that there was a wolf that was very much greater than he was, and that was the wolf that raised him. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you.